The Story of Civilization, Volume 3, Caesar and Christ, Part 2, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 2, Side 1. One did not have to go outside the walls to find these or other ladies of easy persuasion. Ovid assures us that they could be met under the porticos, at the circus, in the theater, as numerous as stars in the sky, and Juvenal found them in the precincts of temples, particularly that of Isis, a goddess lenient to love. Christian authors charged that prostitution was practiced within the cellas and between the altars of Roman temples. Male prostitutes were also available. Condemned by law, tolerated by custom, homosexualism flourished with oriental abandon. "I am stricken with the heavy dart of love," sings Horace. And for whom? For Lyciscus, who claims in tenderness to outdo any woman. From this passion he can be freed only by another flame for some fair maid or slender youth. Martial's choicest epigrams turn upon pederasty, and one of Juvenal's least publishable satires represents the complaint of a woman against this outrageous competition. Erotic poetry of indifferent worth and gender, the Priapia, circulated freely among sophisticated youths and immature adults. Marriage contended bravely with these rival outlets and, helped by anxious parents and matrimonial brokers, managed to find at least temporary husbands for nearly every girl. Unmarried women above 19 were considered old maids, but they were rare. The betrothed couple seldom saw each other. There was no courtship, not even a word for it. Seneca complained that everything else was tested before purchase, but not the bride by the groom. Sentimental attachment before marriage was uncommon. Love poetry was addressed to married women or to women whom the poet never thought of marrying. And women's escapades came after marriage, as under similar conditions in medieval and modern France. The elder Seneca assumed widespread adultery among Roman women, and his philosopher's son thought that a married woman content with 2 lovers was a paragon of fidelity. "Pure women," sang the cynical Ovid, "are only those who have not been asked, and a man who is angry at his wife's amours is a mere rustic." These may be literary conceits. More reliable is the simple epitaph of Quintus Vespillo to his wife. "Seldom do marriages last without divorce until death, but ours continued happily for 41 years. Juvenal tells of a woman who married 8 times in 5 years. Having been wed for property or politics rather than for love, some women considered their duty fulfilled if they surrendered their dowries to their husbands and their persons to their lovers. "Did we not agree," an adulteress in Juvenal explained to her unexpected husband, "that we should both do as we liked?" The emancipation of women was as complete then as now, barring the formalities of the franchise and the letter of dead laws. Legislation kept women subject, custom made them free. In a number of cases, emancipation, as in our time, meant industrialization. Some women worked in shops or factories, especially in the textile trades. Some became lawyers and doctors. Some became politically powerful. The wives of provincial governors reviewed and addressed troops. The Vestal virgins secured political appointments for their friends, and the women of Pompeii announced their political preferences on the walls. Conservatives moaned and gloated over the apparent fulfillment of Cato's warning that if women achieved equality, they would turn it into mastery. Juvenal was horrified to find women actresses, athletes, gladiators, poets. Martial described Juvenal found them in the precincts of temples, particularly that of Isis, a goddess lenient to love. The streets in sedan chairs, exposing themselves on every side to the view. They conversed with men in porticos, parks, gardens, and temple courts. They accompanied them to private or public banquets, to the amphitheater and the theater, where their bare shoulders, said Ovid, give you something charming to contemplate. It was a gay, colorful, multi-sexual society that would have astonished the Periclean Greeks. In the spring, fashionable women filled the boats, shores, and villas of Baiae and other resorts with their laughter, their proud beauty, their amorous audacities, and political intrigue. Old men denounced them longingly. Frivolous or immoral women were then, as now, a conspicuous minority. Quite as numerous, though not always distinct, were the ladies who fell in love with art, religion, or literature. Sulpicia's verses were thought worthy of being handed down with those of Tibullus. They were highly erotic, but as they were addressed to her husband, they were almost virtuous. Martial's friend Theophilo was a philosopher, a real expert on the Stoic and Epicurean systems. Some women busied themselves in philanthropy and social service, gave temples, theaters, and porticos to their towns, and contributed as patronesses to collegia. An inscription at Lanuvium speaks of a curia mulierum, an assembly of women. Rome had a conventus matronarum. Perhaps Italy had a national federation of women's clubs. In any case, after reading Martial and Juvenal, we are disconcerted to find so many good women in Rome. Octavia, faithful to Antony through every betrayal, and rearing devotedly his exotic children. Antonia, her loving daughter, the chaste widow of Drusus, and the perfect mother of Germanicus. Melonia, who publicly reproved Tiberius for his wickedness and then killed herself. Areopita, who, when Caecina Paetus was ordered by Claudius to die, plunged a dagger into her breast and, dying, handed the weapon to her husband with the assuring words, "It does not hurt." Paulina, who tried to die with Seneca. Politta, who, when Nero had her husband executed, began to starve herself, and when the same sentence came to her father, joined him in suicide. Epicharis, the freedwoman who suffered every torture rather than betray the conspiracy of Piso. The unnumbered women who concealed and protected their husbands in the proscriptions, went with them into exile, or like Fannia, wife of Helvidius, defended them at great risk and cost. These alone would tip the scale against all the trollops of Martial's epigrams and Juvenal's stings. Behind such heroines were the nameless wives whose marital fidelity and maternal sacrifices sustained the whole structure of Roman life. The old Roman virtues, pietas, gravitas, simplicitas, the mutual devotion of parents and children, a sober sense of responsibility, an avoidance of extravagance or display, still survived in Roman homes. The refined and wholesome families described in Pliny's letters did not suddenly begin with Nerva and Trajan. They had existed quietly through the age of the despots. They had survived the espionage of emperors, the debasement of a helpless populace, the vulgarity of the demimonde. We catch glimpses of such homes in the epitaphs of mate to mate and of parents to children. Here, reads one, lie the bones of Erbilia, wife of Primus. She was dearer to me than life. She died at 23, beloved of all. Farewell, my consolation. And another, to my dear wife with whom I passed 18 happy years, for love of her I have sworn never to remarry. We can picture these women in their homes, spinning wool, scolding and educating their children, directing servants, carefully administering their modest funds, and sharing with their husbands in the immemorial worship of the household gods. Despite her immorality, it was Rome, not Greece, that raised the family to new heights in the ancient world. 4. Dress. If we may judge from a few hundred statues, the Roman males of Nero's day were stouter and softer in figure and features than the men of the young republic. World rule kept many of them characteristically hard and stern, fearful rather than lovable. But food and wine and sloth had rounded many others into shapes that would have scandalized the Scipios. They still shaved, or more usually were shaved by barbers, or tonsores. A youth's first shave was a holy day in his life. Often he piously dedicated his original whiskers to a god. Common Romans continued the republican tradition and had their hair cut close or even cropped, but an increasing number of dandies had theirs curled. Mark Antony and Domitian are so represented. Many men wore wigs, some had the semblance of hair painted on their pates. All classes, indoors and out, now dressed in a simple tunic or blouse. The toga was donned only for formal occasions, by clients at receptions, and by patricians in the Senate or at the games. Caesar wore a purple toga as a sign of office. Many dignitaries imitated him, but soon the purple robe became a prerogative of the emperors. There were no irksome trousers, no elusive buttons, no drooping hose, but in the 2nd century men began to wrap their legs with fasciae, or bands. Footwear ranged from the sandal, a leather or cork sole attached nippon-wise by a thong between the big and second toes, to the high shoe of full leather, or of leather and cloth, usually worn with the toga in synthesis, or full dress. Roman women of the early empire, as seen in frescoes and statuary, and on coins, were much like the women of the United States at the beginning of the 20th century, except that they were nearly all brunette. Their figures were moderately slender, and their robes gave their carriage a hypnotic grace. They knew the value of sunshine, exercise, and fresh air. Some brandished dumbbells, some swam assiduously, some dieted, others reined in their bosoms with stays. Feminine hair was usually combed back and bound in a knot behind the neck, often enclosed in a net, and tied with a band or ribbon over the head. Later fashions demanded a loftier coiffure, supported by wire and elaborated with a wig of blonde hair imported from German maids. A woman of fashion might occupy several slaves for hours in manicuring her nails and dressing her hair. Cosmetics were as varied as today. Juvenal describes beautification as one of the most important technologies of the age. Physicians, queens, and poets wrote volumes on the subject. A Roman lady's boudoir was an arsenal of cosmetic instruments: tweezers, scissors, razors, files, brushes, combs, strigils, hairnets, wigs, and jars or phials of perfumes, creams, oils, pastes, pumice stone, soaps. Depilatories were used to remove hair, scented ointments to wave it or fix it. Many women applied to their faces a nocturnal mask of dough and ass's milk in a mixture concocted by Poppia, who found it helpful in repairing a bad complexion. Therefore, asses followed her in all her travels. Sometimes she took a whole herd with her and bathed in ass's milk. Faces were whitened or rouged with paint. Brows and eyelashes were dyed black or painted over. Sometimes the veins of the temple were traced with delicate lines of blue. Juvenal complained that a rich woman reeks of Poppian ointments that stick to the lips of her unfortunate husband, who never sees her face. Ovid found these arts disillusioning and advised the ladies to conceal them from their lovers, all but the combing of their hair, which entranced him. Delicate lingerie was now added to the simple feminine garments of pre-Hannibalic Rome. Scarfs fell over the shoulders, and veils made an alluring mystery of the face. In winter, soft furs caressed affluent forms. Silk was so common that men as well as women wore it. Silk and linen were colored with costly dyes. Romans often paid 1,000 denarii for a pound of double-dyed Tyrian wool. Embroideries of gold and silver thread decorated dresses, curtains, carpets, and coverlets. Women's shoes were made of soft leather or cloth, sometimes elaborately cut into an open-work pattern. They might be trimmed with gold and beset with jewelry, and high heels were often added to remedy the shortcomings of nature. Jewelry was an important part of a woman's equipment. Rings, earrings, necklaces, amulets, bracelets, breast chains, brooches were necessities of life. Lallia Paulina once wore a dress covered from head to foot with emeralds and pearls, and carried with her the receipts showing that they cost 40 million sesterces. Pliny describes over 100 varieties of precious stones used in Rome. Expert imitations of these provided a busy industry. Roman emeralds of glass were superior to modern forgeries and were sold as genuine by jewelers as late as the 19th century. Men as well as women were fond of large and conspicuous stones. One senator had in his ring an opal as big as a filbert. Hearing of it, Antony had him proscribed. He escaped, carrying 2 million sesterces on his finger. Doubtless jewelry was then as often a hedge against inflation or revolution. Silver plate was now common in all but the lower classes. Tiberius and later emperors issued edicts against luxury, but these could not be enforced and were soon ignored. Tiberius yielded and confessed that the extravagance of patricians and parvenus gave employment to the artisans of Rome and the East and allowed provincial tribute to flow back from the capital. Without luxury, he said, how could the provinces live? Roman dress was not more luxurious than that of modern women, and far less gorgeous and costly than the garb of medieval lords. Fashion did not change in Rome as rapidly as in modern cities. A good garment might be worn a lifetime and remain in style. But compared with the standards of the Republic before Lucullus and Pompey had brought in the loot and hedonism of the East, upper-class Rome was now an Epicurean paradise of fine clothing, varied food, elegant furniture, and stately homes. Shorn of political leadership, almost of political power, the aristocracy retired from the curia to its palaces and abandoned itself, with no morals but philosophy, to the pursuit of pleasure and the art of life. 5. A Roman Day. The luxuries of the home far outran the luxuries of dress. Floors of marble and mosaic, columns of polychrome marble, alabaster, onyx, walls painted with brilliant murals or encrusted with costly stones, ceilings sometimes coffered in gold or plate glass, tables with citrus wood standing on ivory legs, divans decorated with tortoiseshell, ivory, silver, or gold, Alexandrian brocades or Babylonian coverings, for which common millionaires paid 800,000, Nero 4 million sesterces, beds of bronze fitted with mosquito netting, candelabra of bronze, marble, or glass, statues and paintings and objects of art, vases of Corinthian bronze or murine glass. These were some of the ornaments that crowded the mansions of Nero's age. In such a home, the master lived as in a museum. Slaves had to be bought to guard this wealth, and others to guard these. Some houses had 400 of them, engaged in attendance, supervision, or industry. The life of the great man, even in the privacy of his rooms, was spent in the publicity of his slaves. To eat with a servant at each elbow, to undress with a slave at each boot, to relax with a menial at every door, this is not paradise. To assure the misery of wealth, the great man began his day about 7 by receiving his clients and parasites and offering his cheeks to their kisses. After 2 hours of this he might breakfast. Then he received and returned formal visits of his friends. Etiquette required that one must repay the calls of every friend, help him in his lawsuits and candidacies, attend the betrothal of his daughter, the coming of age of his son, the reading of his poems, the signing of his will. These and other social obligations were performed with a grace and courtesy not exceeded in any civilization. Then the great man went to the Senate, or labored on some governmental commission, or attended to his personal affairs. For the man of modest means, life was simpler, but not less arduous. After the social calls of the early morning, he gave himself to his business till noon. Humble folk were at work by sunrise. As there was little night life, the Roman took full advantage of the day. A light luncheon came at noon, dinner at 3 or 4. The higher the class, the later the hour. After luncheon and a siesta, the peasant and the employed proletaire returned to work till nearly sunset. Others sought recreation outdoors or in the public baths. The Romans of the empire took their bathing more religiously than their gods. Like the Japanese, they could bear public better than private smells, and no ancient people but the Egyptians rivaled them in cleanliness. They carried handkerchiefs, or sudaria, to wipe away their sweat, and brushed their teeth with powders and paste. In the early republic, a bath every 8th day had sufficed. Now one had to bathe daily or risk a marshal's epigram. Even the rustic says Galen bathed every day. Most homes had bathtubs, rich houses had bathroom suites, sparkling with marble, glass, or silver fixtures and taps. But the majority of free Romans relied on the public baths. Ordinarily, these were privately owned. In 33 BC, there were 170 in Rome. In the 4th century AD, there were 856, besides 1,352 public swimming pools. More popular than such establishments were the great baths built by the state, managed by concessionaires and staffed by hundreds of slaves. These thermae, or hot waters, erected by Agrippa, Nero, Titus, Trajan, Caracalla, Alexander Severus, Diocletian, and Constantine, were monuments of the state's socialistic splendor. The baths of Nero had 1,600 marble seats and accommodated 1,600 bathers at one time. The baths of Caracalla and those of Diocletian accommodated 3,000 each. Admission was open to any citizen for a quadrans, or 1.5 cents. The government met the balance of the cost, and apparently oil and service were included in the fee. The baths were open from daybreak to 1 p.m. for women, from 2 to 8 p.m. for men. But mixed bathing was allowed by most of the emperors. Normally, the visitor went first to a dressing room to change his clothes, then to the palestra to box, wrestle, run, jump, hurl the disc or the spear, or play ball. One ball game was like our medicine ball. In another, 2 opposed groups scrambled for a ball and carried it forward against each other with all the enterprise of a modern university. Sometimes professional ball players would come to the baths and give exhibitions. Oldsters who preferred to take their exercise by proxy went to massage rooms and had a slave rub away their fat. Passing to the baths proper, the citizen entered the tepidarium, in this case a warm air room. Thence he went on to the calidarium, or hot air room. If he wished to perspire still more freely, he moved into the laconicum and gasped in superheated steam. Then he took a warm bath and washed himself with a novelty learned from the Gauls, soap, made from tallow and the ashes of the beech or the elm. These warm rooms were the most popular and gave the baths their Greek name. Probably they were Rome's attempt to forestall or mitigate rheumatism and arthritis. The bather progressed to the frigidarium and took a cold bath. He might also dip into the piscina, or swimming pool. Then he had himself rubbed with some oil or ointment, usually made from the olive. This was not washed off, but merely scraped off with a strigil and dried with a towel, so that some oil might be returned to the skin in place of that which the warm baths had removed. The bather seldom left the thermae at this point, for these were clubhouses as well as baths. They provided rooms for games like dice and chess, galleries of painting and statuary, exedrae where friends might sit and converse, libraries and reading rooms, and halls where a musician or a poet might give a recital, or a philosopher might explain the world. In these afternoon hours after the bath, Roman society found its chief meeting point. Both sexes mingled freely in gay but polite association, flirtation, or discussion. There and at the games and in the parks, the Romans could indulge their passion for talk, their fondness for gossip, and learn all the news and scandal of the day. If they wished, they could have dinner in the restaurant at the baths, but most of them dined at home. Perhaps because of the lassitude caused by exercise and warm bathing, the custom was to recline at meals. Once the women had sat apart while the men reclined, now the women reclined beside the men. The triclinium, or dining room, was so named because it usually contained 3 couches, arranged in square magnet form around a serving table. Each couch normally accommodated 3 persons. The diner rested his head on his left arm, and his arm on a cushion, while the body extended diagonally away from the serving table. The poorer classes continued to live chiefly on grains, dairy products, vegetables, fruits, and nuts. Pliny lists a wide assortment of vegetables in the Roman dietary, from garlic to rape. The well-to-do ate meat, with the usual superabundance of reckless carnivores. Pork was the favorite flesh food. Pliny praises the pig for furnishing 50 different dainties. Pork sausages, or botuli, were hawked through the streets in portable ovens, as on our highways today. When one dined at a banquet, he expected rarer foods. The banquet began at 4 and lasted till late in the night or till the next day. The tables were strewn with flowers and parsley. The air was scented with exotic perfumes. The couches were soft with cushions. The servants were stiff with livery. Between the appetizer, or gustatio, and the dessert, or secunda mensa, second table, came the luxury dishes on which the host and his chef prided themselves. Rare fish, rare birds, rare fruit appealed to the curiosity as well as the palate. Mullets were bought at 1,000 sesterces a pound. Asinius Sealer paid 8,000 for one. Juvenal growled that a fisherman cost less than a fish. As an added delight for the guests, the mullet might be brought in alive and boiled before their eyes, that they might enjoy the varied colors it took in the agony of death. Vettius Pollio raised these sesquipedalian fish in a large tank and fed them with unsatisfactory slaves. Eels and snails were considered dainties, but the law forbade the eating of dormice. The wings of ostriches, the tongues of flamingos, the flesh of songbirds, the livers of geese were favorite dishes. Apicius, a famous epicure under Tiberius, invented the pâté de foie gras by fattening the livers of sows with a diet of figs. Custom allowed the diner to empty his stomach with an emetic after a heavy banquet. Some gluttons performed this operation during the meal and then returned to appease their hunger. Vomunt ut edant, edunt ut vomant, said Seneca. They vomit to eat and eat to vomit. Such behavior was exceptional and no worse than the braggart drunkenness of American conventioneers. Pleasanter was the custom of presenting gifts to the guests, or letting flowers or perfumes fall upon them from the ceiling, or entertaining them with music, dancing, poetry, or drama. Conversation, loosened with wine and stimulated by the presence of the other sex, would conclude the evening. We must not think of such banquets as the customary end of a Roman day, or as more frequent in a Roman's life than the dinners cum oratory so popular today. History, like the press, misrepresents life because it loves the exceptional and shuns the newsless career of an honest man or the quiet routine of a normal day. Most Romans were like our neighbors and ourselves. They rose reluctantly, ate too much, worked too much, played too little, loved much, seldom hated, quarreled a bit, talked a great deal, dreamed waking dreams, and slept. 6. A Roman holiday. 1. The stage. Having many gods to worship and many provinces to milk, Rome had many holidays, once solemn with religious pageantry, now gay with secular delight. In summer, many of the poor fled from the humid heat to suburban or riverside taverns or groves, drinking, dining, dancing, and loving in the open air. Those who could afford it might go to the bathing resorts that lined the western coast, or sport with the rich on Baies Bay. In winter, it was the ambition of every caste-conscious Roman to go south, if possible to Rhegium or Tarentum, and return with a coat of tan as a certificate of class. But those who stayed in Rome found entertainment plentiful and cheap. Recitations, lectures, concerts, mimes, plays, athletic contests, prize fights, horse races, chariot races, mortal combats of men with men or beasts, not quite sham naval battles on artificial lakes. Never was a city more bountifully amused. In the early empire there were in the Roman year 76 festival days, on which ludi were performed. Of these, 55 were ludi scenici, devoted to plays or mimes. 22 were games in the circus, the stadium, or the amphitheater. The number of ludi increased until by A.D. 354 they were presented on 175 days in the year. This meant no growth in the Roman drama. On the contrary, the drama decayed while the stage prospered. Original dramas were now written to be read rather than played. The theater contented itself with old Roman and Greek tragedies, old Roman comedies, and mimes. Stars dominated the stage and made huge fortunes. Aesopus, the tragedian, after a life of assiduous extravagance, left 20 million sesterces. Roscius, the comic actor, made 500,000 sesterces a year and became so rich that for several seasons he acted without pay, a scorn of money that made this ex-slave the lion of aristocratic gatherings. The games of the circus and the amphitheater absorbed the interest and coarsened the taste of the public, and the Roman drama died in the arena, another martyr to Roman holidays. Through emphasis on acting and scenery rather than plot or thought, the drama gradually yielded the stage to mimes and pantomimes. The mime contained little dialogue, chose its themes from lowly life, and relied on character sketches presented with skillful mimicry. Freedom of speech having disappeared from the assemblies and the forum, survived for a moment in these brief farces, when a mime would risk his head to earn applause by a double entendre aimed at an emperor or his favorites. Caligula had an actor burned alive in the amphitheater for such an allusion. On the day when the parsimonious Vespasian was buried, a mime imitated the obsequies. During the procession, the corpse sat up and asked how much this funeral was costing the state. 10 million sesterces was the answer. "Give me 100,000, said the imperial cadaver, and throw me into the Tiber." The mime alone admitted women as actors. As these were thereby automatically classed as prostitutes, they had nothing to lose by obscenity. On special occasions, like the Floralia, the audience called upon these performers to remove every garment. Both sexes attended these performances, as in our time. Cicero found brides there, and they found him. By suppressing speech altogether and raising the theme to subjects from classic literature, the pantomime, all mimicry, was evolved out of the mime. There was a profit in foregoing language. The polyglot population of Rome, of which a considerable part could understand only the simplest Latin, followed the action better when unburdened with words. In 21 BC, 2 actors, Pylades of Cilicia and Bathyllus of Alexandria, came to Rome and introduced the pantomime, already popular in the Hellenistic East, by performing one-act plays composed only of music, action, gesture, and dance. Tired of dramas in ancient and pompous verse, Rome welcomed the new art, thrilled to the grace and skill of the actors, enjoyed the gorgeousness of their costumes, the splendor or humor of their masks, the trained and dieted perfection of their figures, the oriental expressiveness of their hands, their quick and versatile impersonation of diverse characters, their sensuous enactment of erotic scenes. Audiences divided into frantic cliques and claques in support of rival favorites. Women of high station fell in love with the actors and pursued them with gifts and embraces, until one literally lost his head over Domitian's wife. The pantomime gradually drove all rivals but the mime from the Roman stage. The drama succumbed to the ballet. 2. Roman music. Such a triumph was made possible by the high development of music and the dance. Under the Republic, dancing had been looked upon as disgraceful. The younger Scipio had compelled the closing of schools that taught music and dancing, and Cicero had remarked that only a lunatic would dance when sober. But the pantomimes made dancing a fashion, then a passion. Nearly every private home, says Seneca, had a dancing platform, echoing to the feet of men and women. Rich households now had a dancing master as well as a chef and a philosopher, as part of their equipment. As practiced in Rome, the dance involved the rhythmical movement of the hands and the upper body, even more than of legs and feet. Women cultivated the art not only for its own attractiveness, but because it gave them flexibility and grace. The Romans loved music only less than power, money, women, and blood. Like nearly everything else in Rome's cultural life, her music came from Greece and had to fight its way against a conservatism that identified art with degeneration. In 115 BC, the censors had forbidden the playing of any instrument except the short Italian flute. A century later, the elder Seneca still considered music unmanly, but meanwhile Varro had devoted a book to De Musica, and this treatise, together with its Greek sources, became the support of many Roman works on musical theory. Finally, the rich and sensuous Greek modes and instruments won the day over Roman awkwardness and simplicity, and music became a regular element in the education of women and frequently of men. By AD 50, it had captured all classes and sexes. Men as well as women spent whole days in hearing, composing, or singing airs. At last, even emperors climbed and descended scales, and the philosophic Hadrian, as well as the effeminate Nero, was proud of his skill on the lyre. Lyric poetry was intended to be sung with music, and music was seldom composed except for poetry. Ancient music was subordinated to the verse, whereas with us the music tends to overwhelm the words. Choral music was popular and was frequently heard at weddings, games, religious ceremonies, and funerals. Horace was deeply moved by the sight and sound of youths and maidens singing his Carmen Seculare. In such choruses all the voices sang the same note, though in different octaves. Part singing was apparently unknown. The basic instruments were the flute and the lyre. Our wind and string orchestras are still variations of these forms. The most heroic symphony is a judicious combination of puffing, plucking, scraping, and beating. The flute accompanied drama and was supposed to arouse emotion. The lyre attended song and was expected to elevate the soul. The flute was long, had many openings, and a greater range of expression than the modern instrument. The lyre and the kithara were like our harp, but took a greater variety of shapes. Among the Greeks they had been of modest size, but the Romans magnified them until Ammianus described kitharas as large as carriages. In general, the Roman instruments, like ours, improved upon earlier ones, chiefly in sonorousness and size. The strings of the lyre were made of gut or sinew and numbered up to 18. They were plucked with a plectrum or with the fingers, which alone could execute the quicker runs. From Alexandria, early in the 1st century, came the hydraulic organ with several registers, stops, and orders of pipes. Nero fell in love with it, and the calm Quintilian was impressed by its versatility and power. Formal concerts were given, and musical contests played a part in some public games. Even modest dinners required a bit of music. Martial promises his guest at least a flute player. As for Trimalchio's feast, the tables are wiped in rhythm with song. Caligula had an orchestra and a chorus on his pleasure boat. At the pantomimes, symphoniae were performed. That is, a chorus sang and danced to the accompaniment of an orchestra. Sometimes the actor would sing the solo parts, sometimes a professional singer, or cantor, sang the words while the actor gestured or danced. It was not unheard of for a pantomime to be accompanied by 3,000 singers and 3,000 dancers. The orchestra was led by flutes, aided by lyres, cymbals, pipes, trumpets, syringes, and scabella, boards fastened to the player's feet and capable of producing a pandemonium even more frightful than that of a modern orchestra at the height of its powers. Seneca mentions harmony in the playing of individuals, but there is no sign that ancient orchestras used harmony contrapuntally. The accompaniment was usually on a higher note than the song, but it did not, so far as we know, pursue a distinct sequence. Virtuosi were plentiful and minor performers abounded. Talent converged from all the provinces upon the center of the world's gold, while the institution of slavery permitted the training of choruses and orchestras on a large but inexpensive scale. Many rich establishments had their own musicians and sent the most promising to famous teachers for advanced instruction. Some became kitharidi and gave concerts in which they sang and played the lyre. Some specialized in singing, usually composing their own songs. Some gave concerts on the organ or the flute like Canis, who boasted in the style of Beethoven that his music could alleviate sorrow, increase joy, elevate piety, and fan the flame of love. These professionals went on extended concert tours throughout the empire, earning plaudits, fees, public monuments, and infatuations. Some, says Juvenal, sold their love for an added honorarium. Women fought for the plectra with which famous players had touched the strings and offered sacrifice at the altars for the victory of their musical favorites in the Neronian and Capitoline games. We can faintly picture the imposing scene when musicians and poets from all the realm competed before great throngs, and the breathless winners received the crown of oak leaves from the emperor's hands. We do not know enough of Roman music to describe its quality. Apparently it was louder, fuller, wilder than the Greek. A weird oriental quality had entered it from Egypt, Asia Minor, and Syria. Old men mourned that recent composers were abandoning the restraint and dignity of the classic style, and were disordering the soul and nerves of youth with extravagant airs and noisy instruments. Certainly no people ever loved music more. The songs of the stage were caught up by a lively and volatile populace and rang through the streets and windows of Rome. The complex airs of the pantomimes were so fondly remembered that devotees could tell from the first notes of a strain to what play and scene it belonged. Rome made no real contribution to music, except perhaps through the better organization of performers into larger groups. But it honored music with exuberant usage and resilient response. It gathered the musical heritage of the ancient world into its temples, theaters, and homes. And when it passed, it left to the church the instruments and elements of the music that moves and deepens us today. 3. The Games. Now that war seemed banished, the great games were the most exciting event of the Roman year. They took place chiefly in celebration of religious festivals, of the Great Mother, of Ceres, of Flora, of Apollo, of Augustus. They might be the plebeian games to appease the plebs, or Roman games in honor of the city and its goddess Roma. They might be offered in connection with triumphs, candidacies, elections, or imperial birthdays. They might, like the Ludi Seculares, commemorate some cycle in Roman history. Like the games of Achilles in honor of Patroclus, those of Italy had originally been offered as a sacrifice to dead men. At the funeral of Brutus Pera, in 264 B.C., his sons gave a spectacle of 3 duels. At the funeral of Marcus Lepidus in 216 B.C., 22 combats were fought. And in 174 B.C., Titus Flaminius celebrated his father's death with gladiatorial games in which 74 men fought. The simplest public games were athletic contests, usually held in a stadium. The performers, mostly professionals and aliens, ran foot races, threw the discus, wrestled, and boxed. The Roman public, accustomed to sanguinary gladiatorial exhibitions, only mildly favored athletics, but relished the prize fights in which massive Greeks fought almost to the death with gloves reinforced at the knuckles with an iron band 3/4 of an inch thick. The gentle Virgil describes a milder pugilistic feast in almost modern terms. Then the son of Anchises brought out hide gloves of equal weight and bound the hands of the antagonists. Each took his stand, poised on tiptoe and raising one arm. Drawing their heads back from the blows, they spar, hand against hand. They aim many hard blows, wildly pummeling each other's sides and chests, ears and brows and cheeks, making the air resound with their strokes. Entellus puts forth his right. Dares slips aside in a nimble dodge. Entellus furiously drives Dares headlong over the arena, redoubling his blows, now with the right hand, now with the left. Then Aeneas put an end to the fray. Dares' mates led him to the ships with his knees shaking, his head swaying from side to side, his mouth spitting teeth and blood. Still more exciting were the races at the Circus Maximus. On 2 successive days, 44 races were run, some of horses and jockeys, some of light 2-wheeled chariots drawn by 2, 3, or 4 horses abreast. The cost was met by rival stables owned by rich men. The jockeys, drivers, and chariots of each stable were costumed or painted in distinctive colors, white, green, red, or blue. And all Rome, as the time for these contests approached, divided into factions named from these colors, and particularly the red and the green. At home, in school, at lectures, in the forums, half the talk was about favorite jockeys and charioteers. Their pictures were everywhere. Their victories were announced in the Acta Diurna. Some of them made great fortunes. Some had statues raised to them in public squares. On the appointed day, 180,000 men and women moved in festive colors to the enormous hippodrome. Enthusiasm rose to a mania. Excited partisans smelled the dung of the animals to assure themselves that the horses of their favorite drivers had been properly fed. The spectators passed by the shops and brothels that lined the outer walls. They filed through hundreds of entrances and sorted themselves with the sweat of anxiety into the great horseshoe of seats. Vendors sold them cushions, for the seats were mostly of hard wood, and the program would last all day. Senators and other dignitaries had special seats of marble, ornamented with bronze. Behind the imperial box was a suite of luxurious rooms where the emperor and his family might eat, drink, rest, bathe, and sleep. Gambling was feverish, and fortunes passed from hand to hand as the day advanced. From openings under the stands emerged the horses, the jockeys and drivers, and the chariots. And each faction shook the stands with applause as its favorite color appeared. The charioteers, mostly slaves, wore bright tunics and shining helmets. In one hand was a whip, and in their belts a knife to cut in accident the traces tied to their waists. Along the middle of the elliptical arena ran the spina, thorn or spine, an island 1,000 feet long adorned with statues and obelisks. At one end were the metai, or measures, circular pillars that served as goals. The usual length of a chariot race was 7 circuits, about 5 miles. The test of skill lay in making the turns at the goals as swiftly and sharply as safety would allow. Collisions were frequent there, and men, chariots, and animals mingled in fascinating tragedy. As the horses or chariots clattered to the final post, the hypnotized audience rose like a swelling sea, gesticulated, waved handkerchiefs, shouted and prayed, groaned and cursed, or exulted in almost supernatural ecstasy. The applause that greeted the winner could be heard far beyond the limits of the city. The most stupendous of all the spectacles offered at Roman celebrations was the sham naval battle. The first large naumachia was given by Caesar in a basin excavated for the purpose on the outskirts of the city. Augustus marked the dedication of his temple to Mars the Avenger by presenting 3,000 fighters in a replica of the Battle of Salamis on an artificial lake 1,800 by 1,200 feet. Claudius, as already noted, celebrated the completion of the Fucine Tunnel, with a conflict of triremes and quadriremes involving 19,000 men. They fought with a disappointing courtesy, and soldiers had to be sent among them to ensure a proper shedding of blood. At the dedication of the Colosseum, Titus had its arena flooded and reproduced that battle of the Corinthians and Corcyraeans which had brought on the Peloponnesian War. The combatants in these engagements were war captives or condemned criminals. They butchered one another until one side or the other was killed off. The victors, if they had cut bravely, might be granted freedom. The games reached their climax in the contests of animals and gladiators in the amphitheater, after Vespasian in the Colosseum. The arena was an immense wooden floor strewn with sand. Parts of this floor could be lowered and then quickly raised with a change of scene, and at brief notice the whole floor could be covered with water. Large chambers beneath it held the animals, machines, and men scheduled for the program of the day. Just above the arena's guard wall was a podium or marble terrace, on whose ornate seats sat senators, priests, and high officials. Above this was the suggestum, a high loge where the emperor and empress sat on thrones of ivory and gold, surrounded by their family and retinue. Behind this aristocratic circle sat the equestrian order, in 20 tiers of seats. A lofty intervening wall, decorated with statuary, separated the upper orders from the lower classes in the stands above. Any free person, male or female, could come, and apparently no admission was charged. The crowd took advantage of the emperor's presence, here and at the circus, to shout its wishes to him, for the pardon of a prisoner or a fallen fighter, the emancipation of a courageous slave, the appearance of favorite gladiators, or some minor reform. From the topmost wall, awnings could be unrolled to the arena railing to shade such parts of the assemblage as might suffer from the sun. Here and there fountains threw up jets of scented water to cool the air. When noon came, most of the spectators hurried below to eat lunch. Concessionaires were on hand to sell them food and sweets and drinks. On occasion, the entire multitude might be fed by the order and bounty of the emperor, or dainties and presents might be scattered among the scrambling crowd. If, as sometimes occurred, contests were presented at night, a circle of lights could be lowered over the arena and the spectators. Bands of musicians performed in the interludes and accompanied the crises of the combats with exciting crescendo strains. The simplest event in the amphitheater was an exhibition of exotic animals. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.